We're coming up on the middle of the year, so this seems like as good a time as any to do a quick middle of the year update on the state of indie games in 2025. Are we in a recovery period like some of the people I talked to last year seemed to think, or are we really slumping now, as I kind of assumed and a lot of people kind of assume? What direction are we going? Are we growing? Are we shrinking? Are there reasons to be worried? That's what we're going to look at today. And this is just a real quick and dirty thing. It's based primarily on just kind of the raw stats from Gamalytic. I finally got around to reading the Newzoo report on the overall state of the market, which by and large was not terribly surprising. Dozens and dozens of charts just telling me things that everybody kind of already knows, that the industry is super saturated and concentrated down to about 20 games, and that those games aren't really growing, they're just poaching each other, so the whole thing seems like it's going to fall apart one of these days. They did have a little bit in that's directly on point for indie games, mostly having to do with Steam and how terrible their discovery is. Something that, again, not a surprise to me because indie developers complain to me about Steam's discovery and visibility all the time, and B, I have used their discovery queue. But it is nice to have numbers to go along with that. Not talking about that today. I will probably do another video on that. So if you are interested in knowing exactly how terrible Steam's discovery is, remember to subscribe so you'll get my next video on the topic. But today we're just looking at pure numbers. And I am going to show you a chart in a moment that's going to compare the revenues, mean, median, and total for the first 4 months for the last 3 years. But before I show you something that on the surface is going to appear very alarming, I want to throw in some really heavy caveats. First, this is exclusively new games. As we talked about last time in the Devolver analysis, a lot of these games, a lot of times it's the older games that are making most of the money. In general, in any given year, about half of the money that goes to indies, at least on Steam, is going to the older ones. So that's not showing up in here. So the overall numbers are better than what you will see. Second, we haven't had a major sale this year. We haven't hit the Steam summer sale yet, and that's going to tell us a lot about how things are going. Although when I do get around to talking about Newzoo, we'll see that the summer sale might not be as big a deal as you might think. But again, that's the next video. And third, and most importantly, this does not take into account when indie games make their revenue. Because traditionally, AAA games make most of their money very quickly, usually within the first week or two, but the indies usually require a little bit of momentum. There was an article on Game Discover Co. not long ago about the idea of long tails, the fact that your typical indie for last year was making at least twice as much money after a year as it did when it first launched, and that can go as high as 10 times or more. So those are all things you need to understand. Things might not turn out to be as bad as they're going to look in the next slide. Just please keep that in mind. That being said, it's not great. You are seeing what I'm seeing. Things have been a little bit slow this year, and that's understandable. This is the dawn of a new hardware year, and that tends to be one of the slowest periods for video games in general, because everyone's just kind of sitting around waiting. So really, the whole market is pretty sluggish, but if you look at AAA games on PC, they're doing about the same at this point as they were last year. So this does appear to be mainly an issue with the smaller developers. But I don't want to suggest that this is at a crisis point, although I do need to note that the median revenue for indie games on Steam has now grown so low that the typical developer is not even recouping what they spend to put the game on Steam in the first place. That's not great. Also not great, the money you are seeing, about half of it, 2 games. Schedule 1 and Repo, 2 games I know very little about, don't care about, except that Schedule 1 is shoved in my face by Steam's wonderful discovery system every time I open it up. Looking at that, I have actually had people argue with me about how concentrated the video game market is because, I bet you haven't even heard of the Pareto principle. This has always been true. This is not 80% going to 20%. At this point, it's more like 95% going to less than 1%. It is so tightly concentrated around an ever smaller number of games. It's not my theory. This is something that's very well documented. We'll talk about that when we get to Newzoo, whenever I get around to doing that particular video. But one thing I suggested the last time we talked about this is that there is a difference between concentration in the AAA space and concentration in the indie space. Insofar as I don't think the indie space is all that concentrated, despite the fact that all the money is going to just a handful of games. The reason that's an issue in the AAA space is that this massive concentration is one reason why the industry is shrinking. It's just concentrated around fewer and fewer games. People aren't spending as much money as they used to. They aren't even spending as much time with video games as they used to. They aren't engaging with them as much on other platforms. You're just seeing a shrinkage. And as I kind of alluded to earlier, from what we've seen, the growth for this has kind of stalled out. These giant forever games are not getting new players. So they're just kind of poaching back and forth. It's a strictly zero-sum game. So this concentration, at least at the top of the industry, is an extremely bad thing, and it's hurting them. But for the indies, it's a little more complicated, because if you look under the massive hits, what you discover is that the overall market, in terms of the people who are buying and playing the games, hasn't actually changed that much. What you see is not really concentration, it's hits. Indie games aren't concentrated in the same way that these AAA games are around a handful of titles or a handful of franchises. It's just that sometimes there are more and bigger hits, and it makes the market look like it's growing or shrinking. Just to give you an example of kind of how the hit-driven nature works, because 2024 was a great example. As I said, this year, kind of all the money so far has gone to 2 games. But by this point in 2024, by when you're going to see this video, we had Balatro, we had Hades 2, Supermarket Simulator, Content Warning, Animal Well, Another Crab's Treasure, and if you skip forward 1 month and go into June, you can throw in the final release of Body Cam, Chained Together, 9 Sols. Last year was really front-loaded with big hits, and I'm even leaving out Pal World there. If you throw in Pal World, if you count that as an indie, that's even crazier. But the point is, what happened isn't so much that the market shrank, it's just that we haven't had as many hits yet. We could have a string of big hits in the back half of the year and see that pulled all the way up again, because that is just what the indie space is like. The overall market, in terms of the people who are buying these games on the regular, hasn't really changed that much. It's just that last year we had a ton of giant hits, and that made it appear that the market had grown. Now, a while back, I mentioned that when you're trying to divide up the people who play games, one even split is to go with your AAA only versus your AAA plus indie. But I also said that if you look at the research, that's a simplification, because there's actually 3 groups. And I want to look at that third group right now, because in between those is a group, and I've seen this in a couple of places, but I'm basing this primarily on some studies that were done by, of all things, payment processors a couple years back, focusing mostly on things like live service games, but they ended up covering a lot of indies too. And what they identified 3 groups that they referred to as traditional gamers, which is your AAA only. You have heavy indie, which are people who buy at least 5 games in a 12-month period. And then you have your casual indie, which are people who buy between 1 and 4, along with presumably some AAA games, although that's not necessarily true. That middle group is important, even though I overlooked them last time. That middle group is important in part because, according to these studies, that's the largest of the 3. About half of all people fall into this category, which makes sense because these days there are enough quote-unquote indie games that get a lot of attention that you do see people who don't really pay attention to the market who will nevertheless buy 1 or 2 of them in a year. And these, I have to imagine, are the people screaming at me in my comments every time I do the Game of the Year list. Very, very easy for me to tell who the heavy players are and who the casual players are, because the heavy players come to you in the spirit of wanting to learn and share, whereas the casual players who maybe got to 1 game in a year come to you with the essence of a zealot bent on conversion by the sword. And it's a very different experience dealing with them. But as I said, that second group is important, even though they don't spend nearly as much money as the heavy indie gamers do, because those are the people who are driving these breakout hits. These could be people who get most of their video game news from more or less what we would call mainstream sources. And so the games they notice tend to be the ones who have that kind of IGN seal of quality on them. Or they could even be people who don't play video games much at all, but then something becomes a meme on TikTok and they see it a bunch and they think, I've got to try that out. But either way, it's these people deciding to interrupt their usual spending habits to go out and buy these games, these specific games, that are really what are creating these big hits out of nowhere and what ultimately are either growing or at least creating the impression of growth in the indie market. At least that's my theory on this. So ultimately, I don't think at the moment that the indie sector is shrinking or growing. I think it's about the same size as it is. It's gotten a lot more competitive because there are more games and there are more big deal games, not just hits, but there are other games. There are franchises like we talked about last time that do kind of suck all the air out of the room. It has become much more competitive, but I don't think it's really larger or smaller. I think the number of people and the amount of money there is about the same as it's been for the last couple of years. But I'm obviously making a lot of assumptions here. The numbers are open to a lot of different interpretations. So if you want to share your interpretation of what these numbers have to say, go ahead and leave it down in the comments.